excited that this is today going forward and we get to build a new tomorrow, by having really hard conversations and talking about these things.
In order for any community or any person, any individual to take back that identity, they've got to challenge these concepts. They have got to break these beliefs. How powerful to know that this is not real, that this whole you're genetically predisposed is not true. That's power, to know that, and then to take that in and then become who you choose to be.
Welcome to episode 6 of Debunked, the only Utah podcast combining evidence-based health practices with storytelling to challenge the stereotypes and debunk the myths about harm reduction, opioids, and substance use disorders. I'm Tim Light, and today we will be discussing the myth that Native Americans have a genetic predisposition to addiction. In this conversation, we'll talk about the science that debunks this myth, the early beginnings of this myth, the impacts that it has on the communities, and why it is important to debunk this myth. Before we jump into the conversation, let's first have our guests introduce themselves.
My name is Michelle Chapoose. I'm a member of the Ute Indian tribe from the Uncompahgre Band. I'm a licensed substance use disorder counselor, and currently I am working with USU on this rural and tribal opioid reduction grant as a tribal opioid resource center coordinator. Thank you.
Hi guys, my name's Ashanti Moritz. I am an enrolled Makah tribal member. I'm also part of the Tlingit from Alaska and Shuswap from Canada. I am the outreach director at Warrior Spirit, and I am just happy to be part of the team.
Hello, my name is Carlos Rivera. I'm an enrolled tribal member with the Sherwood Valley Band of Pomo Indians from Northern California. There's about 22 different bands of my tribe that live along the coast and also in the valleys of Northern California. But I'm also Mexican descent. My dad was born and raised in Mexico. I am the CEO and co-founder at Generation Red Road, which is a Native American, Indigenous, Alaskan Native nonprofit. And we provide training and technical assistance to our communities all over the country, providing curriculum and programs that can help meet their needs with substance abuse and mental illness. Aside from that, I'm also the behavioral health officer at IHS, which is Indian Health Services in Santa Barbara, California. Thank you.
My name is Erin Madden. I'm a research assistant professor at the University of New Mexico. My research is in addiction and harm reduction. And recently I started doing some research with Indian Health Service data on some of the issues related to opioids and stimulant use among New Mexico tribes. I am not an enrolled tribal member. I am a non-Hispanic white person, so I can only speak about this as someone who reads research and does research, but not from any sort of personal experience.
Thanks, Erin, for being with us. We really appreciate all of you for taking the time to be on the show today. Again, the myth that we are debunking today is that Native Americans have a genetic predisposition to addiction. To start out, I want to hear one or two sentences from each of you about, like what you think when you hear this myth. So Carlos, what do you think when you hear this myth?
A couple things come up for me when I hear the myth. One is it puts our people in a victim role. And when you are coming from this place of a victim, it then requires someone from the outside to make a change in order for you to heal from it or for you to make a change. And so I think that in some ways it limits us. It also prevents us from, making this change from within or making changes overall from within, because we're always looking for someone else to do something, to make that difference. And so, yeah, I think that's one thing that I always, whenever I think about that myth or that, that stigma, it just really paralyzes our community at a community level.
Do you feel like it paralyzes individuals as well?
Absolutely. Individuals, which then ripples out to family, and then also at a community level. Then you have this thought process, and the thought process or this consciousness becomes, we're Native, and so we're this is a part of our history. It's a part of our culture. It's a part of who we are. And so with that kind of a mindset, it really does create barriers on top of barriers for our people to truly kind of grasp their own recovery, their own life, their own identity, because the identity then becomes, oh well, we're native, so we're all going to be alcoholics because of this thing that has been passed down from generation on top of generation.
Wow. Yeah, that's profound. Ashanti, what do you think when you first hear this myth?
There's a lot of feelings that come up for me. I think the biggest feeling is probably fear. For me, this was something that was talked about a lot when I was younger, and for me, my parent, my primary parent who raised me, did not grow up in her native culture. She grew up in a different family, and so that being said, there's like, oh well, you're native, so this is what's going to happen to you. That is, where your life is going to go. And it was just like, man, am I going to die from this? Like, at a very young age, I was very debilitized by this thing, and I heard it all the time, and not just within my family or my community. I seen it on TV, I seen it in media, I seen those type of stigmas just like in cartoon shows. I can remember seeing it in comic books and in TV, newspaper ads. It was based around like Native Americans being intoxicated or not being functionable, and I was like, this is going to happen to me. And then when I seen it in my family, it just confirmed, like, this is what I'm supposed to be. This is where I'm supposed to go. And there was a lot of fear in that, because I didn't know if I wanted to identify with Native, when I got to that age, when I get to fill out my bubble in high school. Like, do I want to identify that, or do I want to build a different identity that is not going to be an alcoholic? And that's how ingrained it was from a very young age to me.
So you felt like by just admitting that you were a Native American and by identifying yourself as a Native American, that this myth was so strongly ingrained in you that you felt like that was going to take you down a path of substance use.
Yeah, no matter what, definitely. And that's what people expected from me. I wasn't like that kid that was expected to go to college or to get a degree. Even I hear a lot of myths that go along with that as well. And it was like, nope, I'm gonna end up at the bar, and I'm gonna end up as that parent, or not a parent, or a parent that ends up losing their kids. There was so much fear from a very young age that was built around me being Native American, and this was what was going to happen to me because it was my DNA, and if I looked like my mom, and if I looked like my dad, and I looked like my grandpa, and that's how strong DNA works, then definitely my DNA was going to bring me down this same type of path, or this path of that I just didn't have any control in my outcome.
Thank you for being vulnerable about that. I'm so sorry. Michelle, what do you think when you hear this myth?
So thinking about, hearing how Native American people are predisposed to anything in reality, especially when we're looking at something as life-changing and life-altering as substance uses and substance use disorders. You look at this, the myth itself being so impactful, this belief, because we hear something, you hear it enough, and then you begin to believe what it is. You begin to believe that, like Ashanti had mentioned, that's your destiny in a sense. And it's such a pan-ethnic identity and pan-ethnic concept that all Native American people are going to end up down this road. And so you can see, not only does it has the possibility of impacting somebody's substance use choices, but also it impacts your autonomy. It impacts your, the fact that Native American people forget that they're resilient. that resiliency and that power that's within our culture and our families and our beliefs. But the reality is it's such a widely believed myth. I've had the opportunity to work with young people in education, then in as a substance use disorder counselor, and then in community. And I hear it all the time. And it's so heartbreaking, because then how do you go against, how do you challenge that concept with them when when a young person or somebody who is seeking to find their recovery or their healing has that belief that's been so ingrained. And so I know from a young age, we've all heard it. It's all that this is how you're going to be. You're going to fail school. You're going to be a drunk, or you're going to be a drug addict. That's just your destiny. And so it's like, so why try? And as wrong as it is, it then becomes part of an individual's dialogue. And if you believe that and you engage in that dialogue and that self-talk, those are self-fulfilling prophecies, because then we engage in behaviors or justify behaviors to follow that suit. So, I mean, you can see how it just transcends not just substance use, but all levels of a Native American's identity.
Michelle, earlier when we were talking, you said something about the oppressor.
So when we start talking about oppression, we have individuals and groups, of course, we all know this, that are marginalized. And what eventually happens is when a group of individuals are oppressed, they begin to take on the beliefs of the oppressor. And so there's a resistance that comes with that, the first initial resistance. But you get something pounded on you enough, no expectations, no, you're not expected to succeed. You're not expected to excel. You're not expected to not be addicted to a substance. You begin to believe that. And then that tailors into your own dialogue, because then you start engaging in those oppressive conversations with others. It's like, yeah, we're all just, we're all going to be drunks. We're all going to not have jobs. We're all going to not graduate from high school. And so these concepts are so, they're ingrained. They've been there for a very long time. And so the oppression, those who are oppressed will begin to take the views of the oppressor.
Gosh, from an outsider looking in, it can seem so kind of like superficial, but it's like the tip of the iceberg. It's so dense, and there's, it's so, the effects are so compounding. It's really devastating. Erin, what do you think when you hear this myth?
As someone who has a degree in sociology, I tend to think that when I hear that myth, people are understanding race, right? We think of Native Americans as being members of a race, that they're thinking of race as a genetic or biologic category instead of what it really is, which is a social category, which means that individuals made up this category. It does not map on to shared genetics or shared biology. It maps on to ways in which human beings decided to categorize each other. So we don't categorize each other by eye color, we categorize each other by these sort of boxes. So we've decided that we call races, right? Native Americans, non-Hispanic whites, Asians, right? But these are actually groups of people that are very diverse and don't share necessarily genetic commonalities or biologic commonalities within that group in any meaningful way. So I tend to think that when someone says Native Americans are genetically predisposed to addiction conditions, I tend to think that they're using a genetic explanation for problems, health problems that actually have very external social causes that are not attributable to Native communities themselves, but instead are attributable to the ways those communities have been treated.
Wow, that is so powerful. We have to take a short break. After the break, we'll talk more about the science that debunks this myth, and we'll hear a bit about the early beginnings of this myth. So we'll be right back. The Debunked podcast is made possible by our members and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration Rural Opioid Technical Assistance Program, offering programs to address barriers of access to rural communities related to opioid use disorder. And Regions Blue Cross Blue Shield of Utah works to transform healthcare from the inside out. We reduce confusion, waste, and red tape for members as we help them navigate the healthcare system. Welcome back to Debunked. The myth that we are debunking today is that Native Americans have a genetic predisposition to addiction. So right now we're going to talk about the science that debunks this myth, and then we'll hear a bit about the early beginnings of the myth. So Aaron, can you tell us about, the science that really debunks this myth?
Yeah, I just want to unequivocally state that the myth is not true. So there's a lot of ways that we can measure substance use or addiction. And depending on how we're measuring it, Native Americans may have higher rates than the usual comparison group as non-Hispanic whites, or they might have lower rates. So for example, if we're talking about Utah's overdose rates, Native Americans and non-Hispanic whites have the same rates. If we're talking about alcohol use,
they have the same rates.
Yes, they have the same death rate.
Wow.
Yeah. So they're both high. They're both higher than we'd like them to be, but Native Americans do not surpass non-Hispanic whites for opioid related overdose deaths. They are about the same. If we're talking about, for example, alcohol use, there's multiple ways we can measure alcohol use. We could say, in the past year, have you drank? Actually, if we're using that as the measure, Native Americans are much more likely than non-Hispanic whites to abstain from alcohol use. If we're talking about ever having drank, Native Americans are more likely to never have drank in their lifetime than non-Hispanic white people. If we're talking about alcohol addiction rates, we see slightly higher alcohol addiction rates among Native Americans than non-Hispanic whites. There's multiple ways of measuring these things. And so, we have to be nuanced in how we're talking about it. Even if, though, we say, okay, but there are these few measures that say that Native Americans do have higher rates of, let's say, lifetime ever having an alcohol addiction. Well, I would still argue what we have said earlier in this podcast, which is that this is not because of some sort of genetic factors that Native Americans have that other groups have less of. There is no evidence, no legitimate studies, no scientific consensus that says that Native Americans as a group have more genetic predispositions or risks for addiction than other groups. We see that across groups, the risk genetically is pretty similar. There are other things besides genetics that cause addiction to happen in someone's lives. Genetics are a piece of the puzzle, but they are not the whole puzzle. You need other pieces besides the genetics to happen in your life for you to become addicted to drugs. So some of the other things that increase people's risks for addiction are things like bad things that might happen in your childhood. So one of the ways that we measure that is something called the ACEs score, or the Adverse Childhood Experiences score. The ACE score looks at several things that might happen in your childhood that are very traumatic and put you at risk for a lot of long-term health problems, not just addiction. It includes things like increased blood pressure, things like depression, and addiction. And those sort of adverse childhood experiences, those traumas, include things like physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, things like being separated from your parent because of divorce, because the state separated your parent from you, because of parent death, and also things like living in poverty as a kid, right? So all of those things dramatically increase your chance of experiencing an addiction in your lifetime. And those are social things, right? Those are not your genetics per se. They might interact with your genetic risk. So there's an area of research that we call epigenetics, which looks at the interplay of people's genetics and their social environments, and looks at how environments can kind of turn on or turn off genetic markers for health problems. So if you're exposed to ACEs as a child, you're exposed to these traumas as a child, the thought process is among researchers, you're more likely to have your genetic predispositions for addiction maybe turned on. It's not automatic, it's not always, but you're increasing the likelihood of that being turned on.
And can I just really quick interject? Those genetic predispositions that can be turned on by trauma, those aren't just in Native Americans, right?
No. You may or may not have genetic markers for addiction, but those do not fall along racial lines. So what I mean is that if we're looking at Native Americans as a whole group, we're looking at non-Hispanic whites as a whole group, we're looking at Black people as a whole group, what we see is that if we're taking all those groups together, no one has more genetic predispositions, more genetic risk than anyone else. There's no research showing that. individual families within those groups might have more risk, but as a whole, we do not see any difference between races. There's just no statistics that show that. To go on, right, we said that things in childhood might increase your risk for becoming addicted to drugs at some point in your life, or alcohol at some point in your life. As an adult, things like unemployment, living in poverty can also increase your risk, right? So these are clearly social things that are putting people at risk. And I think what we're going to hear about from your other guests today are the ways in which sort of Native American communities have exposed to some of those ACEs, have been exposed to some of those adult risk factors more than other groups. And that is the reason you see sometimes higher rates of addiction, not some sort of internal genetic reason, but external social reasons that we all are responsible for in this country and across the world. And so if we're thinking about the ACEs scores, right, thinking about Native American history is also really key here, right? Native American boarding schools that operated from the 1800s through 1978, very recently, that separated Native children from their families, clearly increased ACE scores for those children. So it doesn't take a scientist like myself to actually understand that when you separate children on a massive scale from a group of people, you're increasing their ACEs scores, you're increasing their risk for addiction.
Can I just jump in here really quick and say, can you even imagine being separated from your child like that? As a parent, I can't imagine being separated from my child like that. And as a son, I can't imagine as a child being separated from my parents like that. It's just so traumatic. So traumatic.
Yeah, and I just want to say one more thing before I turn it over to everyone else, because I know the issue of boarding schools are going to come up more. And this is, I'm not the one to necessarily speak on this, but I just want to connect it to the science of these, trauma. We do see across the world, indigenous groups of people tend to have higher rates of addiction than the people who moved into their land, right? So we can say indigenous people have higher rates of addiction in many places than their colonizers. But let's do a comparison, right? Do you really think that Native Americans in North America share genetic or biologic traits with Aboriginal people in Australia? They clearly do not. So what is the unifying factor that is facing Aboriginals in Australia and Indigenous people in the United States? It's colonization and how they've been treated.
Thank you. Let's talk about, with the adverse childhood experiences in mind, with those ACEs in mind, let's talk about these origins. Carlos, can you kind of give us some history behind this myth and maybe some of its origins?
Thanks for all of the comments and the teachings and the feedback that I've heard so far. Early on, when Europeans arrived here at what we call today is the United States of America, the land that we lived on, and in this arrival, prior to that, our ancestors utilized herbs and medicines that came naturally from the ground that also, changed the way we thought, but it was utilized for spiritual ceremonial purposes. So, this mind-altering introduction to alcohol, that was new. That was new to us as a people. But the issue, even at that time, it wasn't that, there was this liquid called alcohol, but it was the traumatic experiences that our people were experiencing, such as the massacres. 99% of the Native American population was killed, and only 1% survived by 1920s. And so you imagine, having that such a traumatic experience and then living in it for generation on top of generation and not ever being able to heal from it. So then you go from experiencing this trauma to now I'm just trying to survive with what I have left, which is very, very little in a physical sense, not as an individual, but even as a people. And then you think about, well, man, if they can do it, why can't Native Americans do it? Well, when you are living on the land that your people were massacred on, every day it's a reminder of what happened. And so I think that there are losses that are specific to Native American people that aren't shared by a lot of others. There's that uniqueness there. But then also, keeping in mind, alcohol, as we went on through the generations, it became a way to numb the feelings that we were experiencing because of all the pain, the anger, the guilt. You're lost, you have no identity. This became a way to numb that, and it became an answer to the problem that they were experiencing. It became an excuse in some ways. I know for me it did. It was like, well, that's just the way life is. That's the way my life is going to be, because that's the way it was told to me. And it was just easy for me to say, well, I'm just, this is the way my life is supposed to be. And so it was very easy to do that. Those earlier days, I think that it definitely became a Band-Aid to the problem. It really did. So it wasn't that, again, genetically this was a problem, because then that's also saying that again, we have a disability, right? That's what, when I hear that, I'm like, well, why am I any different from the next person? I have the ability to recover. I have the ability to have a successful life, and whatever that looks like for me. Why do I have to be in this category that in some way, like, I'm weak, or it's I have a disability to this, and I don't accept that. I think that I have the ability to make those changes. And that myth, what it does is it creates this consciousness in our community that prevents us, again, from moving forward. This didn't stop in the 70s. The boarding school continued on in Canada until 1995. And then if you think about it, it's continuing on today in 2020, because right now we have kids at the border of the United States and Mexico who are being separated from their families forcibly, and they're being placed into camps, which, if we don't do something now, we are going to repeat what happened to our people 100 years ago. If we don't do something now for those kids that are in those camps right now, what's going to happen is 50 years from now, we're going to be dealing with that problem again.
Yeah, that's a profound, honest truth right there, and everyone needs to hear that. Carlos, as you were talking about the trauma, talking about the massacres and stuff, I just want to point out again, you said 1920, 99% of Native American population had been massacred.
Correct. So 1% survived, based off of the estimated population. And so those of us alive today, we're that 1%. We're the survivors of that 1%.
That's mind-blowing. And 1920, that was not that long ago, people. That was not that long ago. And then to talk about the traumas, I mean, boarding schools into 1995, and then we have things being repeated again on our borders right now. I mean, gosh. Michelle, can you tell us your thoughts about this and the traumas experienced, like during the 1900s that contribute to this substance use disorder problem, and also, just the myth in general?
Yeah. Trauma is such a complex beast. It has so many far-reaching impacts. And by nature, when somebody experiences a trauma, so traumas happen to different people on varying levels in different situations. So one person could have the same experience, but not be severely impacted like another. But trauma is basically like grabbing a knife and stabbing it into a kitchen table and pulling back. You're causing a permanent scar. There are neurological changes that actually occur. And if somebody has experienced a trauma, it's going to change the way they manage and navigate through day-to-day stressors. So imagine having this displacement. Imagine being taken from your homelands. Imagine being, told to walk. You leave what you know, and then you're taken somewhere else to survive, and it's not even your place. And so that right there is a trauma. And how long ago did that begin? We see it from the beginning. When land is involved, this is the whole process of colonization. People are displaced. People see families are torn apart. There's rapes, there's murders, there's illness, there's, levels of mistrust. There's compacting factors. And so if you have a parent that maybe a grandparent or an aunt that experience this, they're going to teach and navigate through life differently. That child is going to learn from those behaviors that were modeled and those coping mechanisms on how to make it through without necessarily knowing or fully understanding where that came from. And so we see transgenerational trauma responses. I like to talk when we're talking to tribal communities, or when I'm talking to my community, or anybody, when we're talking about addiction and behaviors, and especially trauma. I always tell people, it's like if you were up in the mountains, and you happen to be by the river and you see a bear fishing, and that bear has a distinct way that they fish. Sometimes their bear is out in the water, sometimes the bear is off to the shore, wherever it may be. But if you look to the side, you will most likely see a cub or two cubs watching the bear fish. So what you're seeing is that bear who is out there fishing, that's the way they learn generation upon generation. You see those cubs learning that fishing, that model, how to survive. And when people experience trauma, it's the same concept. We are teaching how to navigate and how to model, even though it may be unhealthy, but it helps distract from the moment. It helps because emotions are so powerful. And if we're not sure what to do with them, the traumas are so powerful. There's a high rate of sexual trauma in our tribal communities. Our young people will learn to cope. And so, I think back about my coping mechanisms that I learned from my father, and the coping mechanisms that he learned from his parents, my grandparents. And so you can see how these events, even though they were in the past, and I hear this a lot, oh, this happened a long time ago, why aren't you people over it yet? Why aren't you guys over this? But these behaviors are passed down, these beliefs are passed down, even though we may see that they're not healthy. There's things that I've done in my life from trauma response, and I didn't realize what I was teaching until now I'm in a place where I found my healing, but then I can see the impact and the behaviors that my own daughter have picked up from the way I coped and the way I managed. And so, people don't realize that, we think about, oh, this happened, like I said, a long time ago. This, why aren't my people didn't do that to you? Or, we hear that, right? That's something we hear all the time. Well, I'm not saying that you did this to me, but the ideas, the concepts, the theologies, the boxes that Native American people have been put in over time and continually put in through marginalization, through, you look at mascots, through the word savage and the way that's used. This continues to perpetuate those, the struggles that Native American people have. It is unique to our nations in the United States because there's still the issue of land possession, there's still the issue of identity. And so, when we talk about the identity issues, you look at blood quantums. So in order for you to be identified as part of a federally recognized tribe, according to the government, you have to meet a blood quantum. So why? And then we have our young people who don't meet that. And then because you're not identified with a federally recognized tribe, do you get lost? And then you hear these, there's just so many components to this whole myth. But it's easy to see how you within this, when you're in it and when you're living it, how you can take it on yourself. You can start to believe that because you're hearing it not just from your tribal community, but you're hearing it from other tribal communities because of all of these, as Aaron talked about the ACE scores, because of all of these social things that have happened to tribal communities, to Native American people, all of these hurts and these wrongs. It's easy enough to use that as an excuse, to be like, okay, yeah, this is where I'm going to go. This is where I'm going to be. This is who I am now because this is what's happened to me and I don't see a way out.
I love, Michelle, thank you for sharing that. I love the example of the bear. So jumping back to the myth that Native Americans are genetically predispositioned to addiction. Shanti, was this kind of ingrained in you as a child, and what ways was this ingrained? Can you talk about that again?
Yeah, as a child, I grew up in a household where addiction and alcoholism was pretty prevalent in my life. And as I got older, probably like 9, 10, I really started noticing, I guess, social norms or what those ACEs really are, right? And different traumatic events, or even the way that my family gathered and what we did when we gathered, or what the adults did when they gathered, and then how it trickled down into my cousins and what we did together when our family gathered together. It was a lot of drinking and a lot of abusing drugs, and that was kind of like right in front of me. And I was probably, maybe, I don't know, 13 about, when I picked up a cigarette, and I was like, oh, I'm really, really cool because I have a cigarette, and I was walking down the street, and my friends were like, whoa, like, you're gonna smoke that? And like, yeah, why not? Like, that's what grown up people do. That is what I see my family doing. And so I mimicked it because, it's kind of like this old saying, like, what you let your ailment be is what your children's ailments will also become, right? So it's kind of, it really, that was huge in my life, right? And alcoholism, for a long time I had this, like, I was really mad at it, and it really hurt, and it really caused a lot of pain and a lot of upset and unjust situations. And sorry, it might make me really emotional. And so I was like, I had no understanding of what alcoholism actually meant. And I was put in foster care, and I was mad at my mom, and I was mad at my family, and I was mad at the world. And I was like 17, 18 years old. Like, no, my mom has a choice. She wakes up and she chooses to drink. And I really believe that with every bit of my soul. I believed that. And so I was mad at her, and I was mad at alcohol. So I really tried to steer clear from it for a long time. And I wouldn't identify with who I am. Like, I'm three quarters, I put up quotation marks, I'm 3/4 native, because that means something somewhere to someone other than to me, but I was just like, man, I'm gonna be that one that teaches her kids to go to powwows. I'm going to be the one that, goes and travels and goes and, spends time in Alaska, spends time in my culture. Like, I am not going to be an alcoholic. And the more fear I put into it, and the more those ACEs came up in my life, the more I did not know how to cope, and the more judgment it fueled this fire. And I definitely, had that stigma my whole entire life that alcoholics, Native Americans were alcoholics, and we didn't go anywhere, and our parents went missing and nothing ever came about with that. And if your auntie went missing, it was just because she didn't want to come home. Or if you're, like, your best friend, one of my best friend, his mom went missing, and it was like, nobody did anything. To this day, I still look for her. I still Google her name. I still Google his name. And I want to know how he's doing, because for a long time he called me and was like, have you seen my mom? And that was the stigma that lived inside of me. Like, alcoholic moms, Native Americans, we just disappear and we leave our kids.
As of 2018, 4 out of 5 Native American women experienced violence in their lifetime. Native American women were 1.7 times more likely than white women to have experienced violence in the last year, and were more likely to experience violence at the hands of non-Native perpetrators than white women. More than half experienced sexual violence in their lifetime, and murder rates of Native American women are more than 10 times the national average in some counties. Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, or MMIWG, is a crisis in the United States, Canada, and among Indigenous women globally. Far too many Indigenous women are going missing. and far too many families are left without answers from law enforcement and the necessary closure to heal from such tragedy. This is just one example of the plethora of marginalization and disparity experienced by Indigenous peoples that clearly contributes to the rates of substance use disorders in these communities.
You know, sure enough, I grew up and I became a mom, and you know, I became really active in that disease of mine, alcoholism. And I had no idea that it wasn't just about taking a drink of alcohol, that it was actually the way that my brain spoke to my inner dialogue. It had everything to do with the habits that I had or didn't have, or you know, the time that I spent obsessing, you know, like if I would have spent that much time instead of being angry at my Native American alcoholic family, like I'm going to go to college and this is what I'm going to do. If I would have put that much time into that, I would, you know, it could have been either way. It's just what you put your energy towards. And when you're young and you grow up and you're on the reservation or you're in your family, you know, and you see this disease and it's all around you, I really didn't know where to spend my energy. I didn't know that the fear could consume me, and that that's what, you know, would be the fire to this disease that lives inside of me. You know, I'm super grateful to be sober. I'm super grateful to have a different outlook on life today and to be a mom who shows up for her kids. And I seen my daughter for the first time in 7 years, and it is the biggest blessing. And I even having that conversation with her is like, man, find an outlet. And I see that you're sitting in pain, but you don't have to sit there alone. And it's not a conversation of like, if you're going to sit there alone and you don't handle this, you're going to be an alcoholic. Like that is not part of the conversation, because people like us today together, we are really talking about this is a change, right? And that's how change happens, when you talk about it, when you put passion behind wanting something to be known. And I'm really passionate about wanting my community to know that there are myths and there are stigmas, and we do not have to live behind them, and we can grow and be whomever we want and do and follow our dreams and our paths and our traditions, right? Like back in the day, I could imagine at 11, I probably, you know, 100, 200 years ago was like a rite of passage, and you get to write a song, or your whole entire community celebrates you coming into like this womanhood or this other part of your life, right? And I could imagine all the stories that come along with it and the healthiness and the embracing of it. And now, you know, like this different way of life, and we've lost those traditions and we've lost some of those stories. And I'm really excited that this is today going forward, and we get to build a new tomorrow, you know, by having really hard conversations and talking about these things.
So I love how, you know, we had talked about that with this myth that our people, our Native American people, forget the resiliency and the power that they have. And so about, you know, a lot of this is about restoring that individualism, that ability to know that our, you know, we are not predisposed to this. You know, everybody has the opportunity and the ability to flourish. And so debunking this myth is what's going to help our tribal communities, but also not only our tribal communities, because other people are going to be listening to this also, but to remind us that we are resilient as individuals, that our resiliency is within our identity. And sometimes our identities have been taken from us. And so what do you do when you're in this place, trying to find out who you are, trying to find out where you fit? It's realizing that you have that power to create that. You can find those teachings, you know, to be so open to creating yourself and knowing that you have that ability and that power to do that. That is where healing happens. When that resiliency is taken away from you, there's, then you go down these different paths. Then you're more likely to go down the belief, that path, that myth that you are predisposed to this, because you fail to realize, or that part is taken away from you, that you are resilient and that you are powerful and that you are an individual and you have every right and every choice within you to have a different path. But when you're beaten down and you learn coping, and you're hurt, you're wounded, whether they're your own individual hurts or they're wounds that have been passed down from generations because of the hurt that tribal communities and Native American populations have gone through, you forget the resiliency and the power and the fact that you're still here.
Thank you, Michelle. It's just so moving and powerful. We have to take a break. After the break, we'll hear from Carlos. He's going to tell us a bit about boarding schools and kind of paint that picture of what it looked like for people, what contributed to those ACEs we've been talking about. And then we'll talk about those broader impacts. So we'll be right back. The Debunked podcast is made possible by our members, and USU's Department of Kinesiology and Health Science is committed to educating and serving students and members of both local and extended communities in the fields of kinesiology and health science. Information at khs.usu.edu. And the Emma Eccles Jones College of Education and Human Services, committed to quality teaching, outreach, and research, offering services to the community and providing students with real-world service and research opportunities. Information at khs.usu.edu. Welcome back to Debunked. The myth that we are debunking today is that Native Americans have a genetic predisposition to addiction. So earlier in the show, we've been talking about adverse childhood experiences. We've been talking about how those adverse childhood experiences have been, contributed to addictions all over the world, but in Native American populations, and some of those unique factors contributing to adverse childhood experiences in Native American populations. So Carlos, can you tell us about the boarding schools, what those, when those started, what those kind of look like?
Yes. Well, the boarding schools, they were established in the late 1800s as not the last, but one of the last policies that was established by the United States government to seize land and also to assimilate the Native American people to America, to the Western world. And so the boarding school was established for the families and the Native people who lived through the massacres, who were the ones that were left after all the killings. Because let me remind everyone that the plan was to exterminate all Native people. It wasn't to save anyone. It was to kill all Native people, and that was actually the slogan that was behind that policy at the time, was "Kill the Indian and save the man."
Kill the Indian, save the man was coined in a speech given in 1892 by Captain Richard H. Pratt on the education of Native Americans. Quote, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him, and save the man." Captain Pratt professed a belief that Native Americans as human beings deserved the same rights, privileges, and pursuits of happiness as their white counterparts, but denied themselves these privileges by choosing to participate and cultivate, quote, a lesser, quote, even a savage lifestyle, language, and culture. Thus, under Captain Pratt, Native American boarding schools were advertised to the general public as a charitable contribution on the part of the U.S. government to Native Americans in an attempt to, quote, Americanize and to, quote, civilize Native Americans.
You should just get over it. It's been so long. Well, try getting over that, right? It's almost impossible, meaning that in some ways it's going to be with us for the rest of my life. But I learned how to heal, and I learned how to live life and thrive, not survive. So, okay, so now going back to this boarding school, it was established to to take children. Some of them volunteered. Early on, it was by force. But when these kids were put into these boarding schools, they had to learn English, and it's true that if they did speak their native language, there was punishment for that. It was very brutal. I met an elder about 10 years ago, and she would be beaten, taken away from the group and be beaten for speaking her language. That was probably a light punishment compared to others. I've heard stories where elders, at the time they were kids, they lost fingers because they were caught speaking their language. And it took this one elder to lose 3 fingers because she didn't understand English, or she didn't understand what they were saying to her or why she was in trouble. But then it took her to lose 3 fingers before she realized, I speak my language, I lose a finger, and that's my punishment. So those stories did happen. In those boarding schools, other Native kids were also taught to hate each other. And so they would bully each other in boarding school. They would hurt each other in boarding school. In these boarding schools, sexual abuse did happen. And there's stories from elders who talk about, the sexual abuse that they experience in there. And so, the boarding school really impacted, I think, especially now in current conditions, because at one time, we take a look at our ceremonies, we take a look at the way we lived on Mother Earth. There was a way in which we did that, and we didn't call it systems of care or anything like that. It was the way we lived through culture and spirituality, and we were enriched in our culture and language and spirituality. Then we look back in the history and we look at, well, where did we lose that? Where was it impacted? And we believe that the boarding school, it impacted, a lot of the losses of our identity. And so when those kids eventually they grew up in boarding school, because not all of them died, they grew up and they went back home. And so when they went back home, this is where we believe that the alcoholism really spread across our communities at a high level. Because again, you go back to your community, which at one time it was probably looked different than it did when you returned home. And when you return home, it doesn't look the same as when you left it. Now there's there's depression, there's anxiety, there's anger. As the community came back together, it no longer appeared the same way it did. There was no more teachings. There was no more culture, because we were also, it was outlawed. It wasn't until 1976 when the Religious Freedom Act passed, in which Native American people were allowed to practice their ceremony again. Because prior to that, if you were caught practicing your ceremonies, such as Sundance, Bear Dance, Ghost Dance, a Sweat Lodge, if you were caught practicing those, you would be killed or even imprisoned for doing those.
The American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978 states, "On and after August 11, 1978, it shall be the policy of the United States to protect and preserve for American Indians their inherent right of freedom to believe, express, and exercise the traditional religions of the American Indian, Eskimo, Aleut, and Native Hawaiians, including but not limited to access to sites, use and possession of sacred objects, and the freedom to worship through ceremonials and traditional rites."
When I think about the depth of pain that causes and how it impacts us today, it really did, impact us. And then you have generations like myself and others who we grew up in a family that in some ways we were assimilated. In some ways we grew up in maybe in a city, and we didn't learn about the culture. I didn't learn about culture and spirituality until I got clean and sober. Prior to that, all I knew, I was Native, and that I was an alcoholic, and that I was Mexican, and that that's really all I knew. and that I was going to go to jail or end up in prison for life or die at a young age. That was the only outcomes for me. My grandma went to boarding school in 1940 to 1945, and being raised by a single grandmother, we were just existing. It was no culture, there was no religion, there was nothing. We were just living every day, existing every day. And so my story, much like Ashanti shared a little while ago, we're telling the story of thousands of other Native people who grew up as this generation of our grandparents and parents that went to boarding school. The result is we lost a lot. I think in the physical world, we might have lost a lot, and that also impacted us. But when I think about it on a spiritual level, the answers are right in here. They're within us. And so I learned to look within to find it. The boarding school and what it did to our people, it ruined relationships. We didn't know how to, we didn't learn about healthy relationships. I didn't have a relationship with my mom or dad when I was a young person. I didn't know if that was even possible. And when I look at the other adults in my life, I learned from them. And what I know today was that all those relationships, for the most part, was unhealthy. And then so I carried that along into my adult life, and I had to learn all that over again as an adult. I had to learn how to be in a relationship with just people, humans. I had to learn my identity, my purpose, because of the boarding school really took a lot of that away. And so my grandma went to boarding school, and what she experienced, it was passed down to my mom. My mom did not heal from it, so then it passed down to me. If I don't heal from it, what's going to happen is I will pass it down to my kids and then my future generations. And so I was willing to do the work now. I became willing to cry now so that my kids don't have to cry no more. I was willing to look at the pain now so that they don't have to look at the pain in the future. Because what's happening right now at a global level, this virus that's killing our people, it's activating again trauma that's already inside, the grief that's already inside here. It's activating it, and it's intensifying it. And I think about my kids going into the future, they're going to have to deal with this stuff plus a lot more. And I don't want them to have to deal with my trauma and my grief on top of all of that. So I'm willing to do the work now so that they have a better future. Thank you.
No, thank you, Carlos. I wanted to hear from all of you one last time about why it's important to you that this myth is debunked.
Yeah, I think everything everyone has shared is so important, and much more important than the things that I've said, as someone who just reads about this stuff. All I want to add is just that if we sort of let this myth go on, it says that the causes of addiction are wholly internal and thus unchangeable by the rest of us, right? The only people who could change it if it's genetic are people, with PhDs and MDs who are working on research and can do gene therapy. That's not true. There are so many social causes of addiction that are modifiable, which means we can change them. And I think emphasizing that and emphasizing the ways in which we, as people who live in this country, but are global citizens as well, we have a responsibility to help reduce risk factors for all sorts of bad health outcomes. And we know the social risk factors that increase risk for addiction. There are these adverse childhood experiences, their unemployment, their poverty, their mistreatment, and that we have a responsibility to address those. And so when you hear or sort of levels of addiction differ by race, note that it's not race that's causing that, it's racism. It's the way we treat communities of color and have mistreated communities of color. And so whenever you hear, African Americans have this different rate of disease than whites, or Native Americans have this different disease than whites, it's not because of some sort of internal genetic differences between us. It's because of the social conditions around us.
Yeah, I think it's really important to spend time busting this myth so that we can really put a stop to the stigma that we have in our Native communities and with our Native youth, and even our elders, that we can really bring light to this. And it's really important to have information that Erin just reads, but she gets to share and educate and enlighten us, and has this amazing level of compassion and understanding of how important it is how we speak to each other and how we speak about ourselves, right? And not letting alcoholism and addiction run rampant, especially like Carlos said. I'm willing to put in that work, man. I will put in the work so that this can stop here, right? I will put in conversations like this so we can have different enlightened conversations about what we really do bring to the table, and not just a social norm or unsocial, but on a real spiritual level. So yeah, thank you so much for the time.
Thanks, Ashanti. Carlos, why is it important to you to debunk this myth?
It's important to me, as I think about this myth and changing the way we believe about this myth, that it's not true, because I think it allows us and gives us one more step towards allowing ourselves the permission to make changes. I think that we can utilize, as Indigenous Native people, without knowing this, we put up barrier on top of barrier, and we learn how to do that from the oppressor. So if we can, take a look at the way we think and where did it come from? Why do I have the thought that I have? If we can start to study, ourselves and the way we function, and moving us one step closer to allowing ourselves the permission to make changes. Because when I think about the traumatic experiences, and then the result of that is grief, because there are two separate entities. They're not the same thing. We have trauma and we have grief. And when I take a look at alcohol and drugs, the liquor stores, all of these things that are hurting our community, they are not waiting around asking for permission. They're not saying, well, hold up, is it a good time to come into this community now and introduce opioids? Is it a perfect time now to come in and introduce methamphetamine? No, those things are doing it. They're doing it now. And so I think it's very important at this level that if we can allow ourselves to change the way we think, then the things around us will change.
Gosh, thank you. Michelle, why is it important to you to debunk this myth?
I think it's important because understanding that individuals are individual, and sometimes we get so stuck in these pan identities, these pan ethnic identities, and it takes away, like, Carlos had mentioned it, Ashanti had mentioned it, and Erin, about it. It's all of a sudden you're put inside this box, and it takes away your individual identity. And in order for any community or any person, any individual to take back that identity, they've got to challenge these concepts. They have got to break these beliefs. The moment you break those beliefs, the moment you begin to empower yourself. And I know I use the word empower a lot because that's what this is about. It's about empowerment on your level, in order for you to achieve what you decide you want to achieve. Not that what's destined for you to achieve, but there are some people who are destined for greatness. And I do believe that a majority of people, especially within our tribal communities, are destined for greatness. They are leaders, they're resilient. I look at our young people and I think, you are a warrior. Break that belief that you're not. And rise to who you are. And so challenging this thought, challenging these beliefs is going to bring back power. It's going to bring the conversation to the table. It's a difficult conversation for a lot of people to talk about because then there's a lot of ownership. Ownership is always hard because then you have to also look at your part in that. It's not that the world is done to you. We have a part in that also. And so to find that and break those barriers and to find that healing, that's what's going to help you reach the level that you're able to reach with with the healing, with the experience, with the knowledge that you have at that moment. But that moment is going to you're going to continue to build on that. And how powerful to know that this is not real, that this whole you're genetically predisposed is not true. That's power, to know that, and then to take that in and then become who you choose to be.
The Debunked podcast is made possible by our members and the Tribal and Rural Opioid Initiative of Utah State University, an effort to address opioid use among rural Utahns in the hopes of eliminating myths and promoting health. Information at khs.usu.edu/outreach. If you'd like to learn more about harm reduction and health and wellness overall, we want to inform you of the Master Health Volunteer Program, or MHVP. This online curriculum was created in order to help you learn about multiple health topics as well as volunteerism in your community. As our current situations change due to COVID-19, many people are transitioning to online learning. This program is an amazing opportunity to increase your knowledge about health and wellness and create a unique volunteer project based on your personal interests and passions. To find out how you can become a part of the Master Health Volunteer Program, visit bit.ly/MHVP 2020. Thanks for joining us today on Debunked, the only Utah podcast combining evidence-based health practices with storytelling to challenge the stereotypes and debunk the myths about harm reduction, opioids, and substance use disorders. I'm Tim Light, and today we debunked the myth that Native Americans have a genetic predisposition to addiction. Join us for episode 7 on July 8th, where we will be debunking the myth that the only legitimate treatment for addiction is abstinence. Today we talked about the science that debunks this myth. We talked about how this myth is ingrained in people from a young age, and we talked about some of the historical components contributing to adverse childhood experiences among Native Americans, such as boarding schools and massacres. You can find links to the sources supporting the historical components mentioned in this episode on our social media platforms at debunkedpod. Speaking of social media, check us out on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube at debunkedpod, or on our website at bit.ly/debunkedpod. Don't forget to tell all your friends about Debunked and remind them that they can find the show on the podcast app, Spotify, upr.org, and anywhere else they get their podcasts. Debunked is produced in collaboration with Utah Public Radio. Funding for the show comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the Office of Health Equity and Community Engagement, the Utah State University Department of Kinesiology and Health Sciences, and Regents Blue Cross Blue Shield. Our editorial board is Jay Hymas, Adam Baxter, Ashanti Moritz, Savannah Ely, Dr. Sandra Solzer, Dr. Suzanne Prevedel, Dr. Aaron Fanning Madden, Mindy Vincent, Patrick Rizak, Michelle Chapus, Dr. Maren Voss, Dr. Amy Kahn, Trisha Glass, Lloyd Arrive, Hillary Deesh, Jennifer Petrus, and Susie Baker. Debunked is produced by Nick Porth, Shalane Smith-Needham, and Friend Weller, with Nick Porth serving as lead producer. Our creative specialist is Autumn Gibbs. Music for today's episode was created by Nick Porth. Our science advisor is Dr. Aaron Fanning Madden, and our program directors are Dr. Sandra Solzer and Dr. Suzanne Prevedel. I'm Tim Light, host and editorial board member.